Hello! I was wondering if I might trouble you for a cup of strong black coffee, and in the process engage you with an anecdote of no small amusement.
Welcome to podcast. I'm your podcast. I'm Megan. Hi.
I'm John. This is what happens when I put you in charge. You criticize my intros.
Welcome back to the NerdyVerse podcast.
Yes, Yar. Well,
Yar.
NerdyVerse series. I don't know. Apparently it's more confusing than I thought it would be.
Welcome back to Sparta.
NerdyVerse is a thing we do on Nerd Herder. So much nerd. Welcome to it. Welcome to Nerd Town.
Welcome to Pineapple on Pizza.
NerdyVerse is where we nerd out and talk about things other than Star Wars, because Nerd Herder is all Star Wars all the time. Yeah. So this is our break from Star Wars because we do like other things.
Yeah. And to clarify, we don't like pineapple on pizza. We just like stirring the pot.
I actually I've said this before. We literally talked about it on your episode last week where we were talking about the highest of pizza eaters and entrepreneurs, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yes. I thought you were about to say pizza and parsecs.
No, we couldn't talk about TMNT without talking about pizza, of course. But
true.
No, yeah, like I've said, morning after pineapple pizza is the only way to enjoy it, but it is enjoyable. It's nice it's nice morning pizza. So, I mean, again, sometimes it's just about the right way to do things. Yes, pineapple pizza itself might not be great, but have you tried it in every way possible to enjoy it? Like, it's just one of those things where it's just like, yeah, you've had it this way, but have you had it this way? Because that could potentially change your entire life.
So what you're saying is, I just need to feed you supreme pizza in a certain way for you to like it.
No, well, I mean, yes, technically, just because, I mean, it's about the toppings. Like,
so take off the peppers, take off the mushrooms, take off the
peppers
onions.
Are fine. The everything's fine but the mushrooms. But it's also just like they're chunky. Like they're just way too huge. And in general, I'm against large toppings on pizza. Like, yes, okay, give me bacon. Don't give me like just a slice of bacon. Like, crumble it. Like, come on. So it's all about the delivery method. It's important.
Have you seen the picture? I'm pretty sure it's a deep fried meme of the pizza that's just one big pepperoni on top.
That's actually pretty decent because at that point it's literally a topping. So,
but is it too much pepperoni?
No, never.
All right.
So, but anyway, yes, the delivery method of the nerddom this week is this podcast to somehow bring it back on topic.
Halo.
Yeah. Thanks for just throwing it out there.
Sorry.
No poise or.
Listen, they read the title. They know what we're talking about.
Apparently.
You know what's up.
Well, and we did talk about it. We announced it last week. So yes, NerdyVerse is taking a dip into a very deep, very big sci-fi lore universe, more so than I think a lot of people realize. I love Halo, the games, but also specifically the lore. I'm not a multiplayer person when it comes to Halo because I'm not a multiplayer gamer in general. Mm-hmm. I play games for stories, and Halo, in and of itself as games, has significant story. And you can enjoy the games based on the story itself that's presented. What's given to you in the games is enough story for you to have motivation in the game, to accomplish the game, and explain the game. But there's a lot of lore that precedes and follows what goes on in the games that really reminds you that Master Chief is not the story. And that's the most significant thing about all of this when we get into the lore. And most people will probably hate this episode and maybe all of the lore about Halo just because it's different. This is not going to be a series of episodes where we talk about just the games or anything like that. I wanted to focus specifically on story because the story is so shunned, because so many people just know Halo, the games. They only know Master Chief. They only know humans versus aliens. And there's just a lot more in the universe of Halo that has just been lovingly crafted. And I am one of the people that really, really, really enjoy all of this stuff. Again, not because I have to have it to make everything make sense, but because it was put in front of me and I get to choose. And that's the best kind of lore. The lore that's not necessary. Like, you don't have to read the books. You don't have to read the comics. You don't have to know all of this stuff. But it is there. And that's what lets you know how lovingly made this Halo universe is because these people made book after book, on nearly 30 books, several comic series, 2 additional side games. So much is packed in, all with the understanding not everybody's going to read this, especially like the hardcore gamers. And, you know, and that's kind of okay. But that's why I wanted to peel back the curtain on the lore a little bit to be able to kind of just highlight the bigger story of Halo because it's one of my favorite sci-fi mythos out of Star Wars. Just because it's so big, it's so complex, and there's a lot of layers to it. And so whenever I meet someone that likes Halo, I always like to ask if they've read the books or if not, then talk about the books. And so that's essentially what this platform is going to be for a little while. And again, you might hate it,
but my episodes are coming soon.
Right. I think mostly this first episode is going to suck for everybody because this has nothing to do with Master Chief.
And just to give context to, you know, podcast in general, I've never played a Halo.
Yeah.
I've played Halo. I've played Halo 3 multiplayer.
Mm-hmm.
We built, we did the fort game where you build a fort and you have to storm the fort.
Mm-hmm.
I was like 10 or 12 at the time, so I don't remember. But I got stuck in Halo 1 in driving the Warthog.
Yes, you're notoriously bad at driving in general in games.
Yeah, Justin can tell you that.
Yeah, well, and that was eventually somewhere I was going to get to in terms of, like, not that you represent everyone, because, I mean, even when it comes to games, you're not that big into Halo. But when you think of Halo, what do you think of? Like, what first comes to mind?
I think of Master Chef.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing for everybody is Master Chief is the face of Halo.
That's ironic.
Yeah. You know, he's the Zelda. He's the, you know, less spoken. What?
You called him Zelda.
Oh,
his
Link.
name's
Whatever. He's the one that does the thing. He's the one that wins.
He's the video game boy.
Yeah. No, he's the blank slate for you to relate to until you get to Halo 4, which has significant story development for him that was long overdue. But, like, he's who you experience the world through. He's not meant to be complex. And that's why he's the face. He's you when it comes to how you experience Halo. And arguably that's the irony of it, and that's the story of it, is that, you know, what's being experienced in the games and through a single character is minuscule amounts of the story that's been going on within that universe. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's the thing is he's acting on what he knows in those moments in those games to accomplish those levels, when in reality there's so much behind all of it. Why the Halos exist, you know, what the great journey is, all of these things. And so, yet again, being a reason why I wanted to dive into the lore and talk about that, because I just think it's just unexplored, unknown. And for those who do know it, maybe you like it, or maybe you gave it a chance or anything. When it comes to unknown lore of Halo, though, what we'll talk about here, because I'm going in a chronological order, again, this is why I think most people are going to hate this episode, is because this is the most disconnected from anything Halo ever.
Yeah, buckle in, boys and girls,
Halo,
and friends.
Yes, Halo is all about Marines versus aliens. It's about Space Marines versus aliens. Starship Troopers, Colonial Marines meets, you know, just bad alien dudes. Mm-hmm. That's the general plot of most Halo, and the origins of the universe of Halo have nothing to do with that. There's a lot that predates what eventually happens in the games and what we most experience. So much so that it's literally billions of years before any of the games start.
And billions of years. Not to get all Carl Sagan on you.
I don't know who that is, but okay.
You didn't have a childhood.
I mean, we've discussed that.
You didn't fall asleep in front of the television.
I mean, I did with other things, non-educational things, apparently. So most of what I'm going to talk about is kind of known as the Forerunner history or the Forerunner saga, even in a series of books that was written by Greg Bear mostly, but there's other side media that discussed this story. But if you don't, I mean, so Halo, when we talk about Halo, yes, is the video games because that's what started everything.
Yeah.
But essentially what Bungie, the creators, did was they had explanations for why everything existed, even if they didn't talk about it in the games.
Mm-hmm.
What the Halo was, all of this stuff, they talked, like they had story for.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually that story just came out. They started to tell that story through, books and other outside media. But again, gamers don't read. So most people just know the presented video game story. You look like you were going to say something.
I was just going to point out the fact that I was North Carolina educated. I can't read.
Yes, that's a good way to insult an entire state.
I'm from North Carolina, all right?
But in going chronologically, to understand what sets up some of the events that happen, again, we're going about several billion. In one point, they basically quote it as 100 billion years, but Earth is supposedly only 13 billion years old. And I say supposedly because carbon dating is still not necessarily trustworthy. You can fight me on that one. I don't care.
Excuse me. Jesus created the world in 2000.
Like 2,000 years ago, yes.
It's 2020, right? I think I know how.
Don't worry, the Bible will get mentioned a few times. But no, essentially at the beginning of the universe is where the story of Halo begins. And it's not with Master Chief or anything like that, but with a very highly intelligent species. And so join me in a super lore-heavy, science-heavy, word-babbly lore discussion as we discuss the origins of Halo. So to understand the story of Halo beyond that of fun and pretty games, you have to travel back in time, billions of years. At one point, a species later called and known as the precursors had evolved far beyond any conventional understanding as we have today, and they came to the Milky Way and created exponentially complex things and even simple things like biological life. Do we owe all of life to them? Possibly. Who knows? A lot of their history has been lost to time, but because of the precursors' heightened understanding and practice of what came to be called neural physics, they were able to bend and tamper with the galaxy in unimaginable ways. Neural physics is essentially the science and belief that everything is alive and connected in the known universe, and by understanding and manipulating that, many creations could exist that were something like that out of your imaginations. All the while that they created, they also stored all of their knowledge in the domain. The domain was a blended database of spirit and technology that had everything forever that was accessible to those who transcended because of their understanding and practice of neural physics. But knowledge added further and further from the origin point became more foggy, and as more knowledge was added, more disappeared. Thus, the more that was known, the less was remembered. Because they were so advanced, they believed it was their responsibility to uphold the galaxy, and they eventually expected to pass this mantle to one of their creations. The two greatest of these creations being the Forerunners and the humans. The humans were just humans, although more advanced than we are even now in 2020, but for the Forerunners, they were the assistants to, and therefore the closest to, the precursors. And for a long time, they were the heir to the mantle of responsibility. But for one reason or another that has been lost to time, the Forerunners were judged unworthy by the precursors and were planned to be wiped out and likely taken back to creation in order to start over and try again. And in the meantime, the mantle would have passed to the humans. But the Forerunners learned this, and they struck first, wiping out their creators and stealing the mantle of responsibility for themselves.
So it's a lot like the engineers from Prometheus.
Actually pretty similar in terms of in that intro where he drinks the liquid that basically breaks down his molecular structure, and by breaking down, you then can create, and eventually, like, David bastardizes that to create the xenomorphs.
Yeah.
Neurophysics is essentially that. By understanding that everything is alive, from dust to meteors to light, like, and when literally everything, you can then coerce it to interact with other living things and create living things. So they would create things that were technology, but more than that somehow. Neurophysics is hard to really get a complete grasp on because it is very in the realms of science fiction, although it might sound pretty realistic. The fact that everything is alive, like, we would believe that about plants and algae and coral, because although they're arguably physical and seemingly environmental, they are alive. Venus flytraps are a great example. Sunflowers are a great example, and the sort. And so we would think that about those things, but not necessarily about sand or rocks. But precursors believed everything was alive, and if they believed that and transcended to a point, they could manipulate that.
Yeah.
And what they created out of manipulating living matter like that was near indestructible, transcended material, essentially. So just like they were transcended because of their understanding, what they created was transcended. And so now certain things were more naturally, like, if you believe in Darwinism, we believe, like, okay, then humans evolved from this and that.
Yeah.
That's not neurophysics. That's just evolution. Neurophysics would be actually creating through tampering. Anything created by that, would be essentially indestructible. But also, because mainly the reason it was indestructible is because you couldn't understand it, if that makes sense. Like, why can't I break this glass that they made? Well, because you don't understand it. Again, it's really sci-fi, but
it's incredibly sci-fi.
Yeah.
And in reality, it makes it a lot more plausible for later concepts like the Spartans, like, superhuman people.
Essentially what you see is this god complex amongst characters. Throughout the story of Halo, that's always present. From the precursors creating and manipulating life to the forerunners that have stolen the mantle, then doing the same thing. And now you've got humans, billions of years later, tampering with life because we need to be stronger, we need to be faster, we need to be able to combat anything that comes against us. And so it's this interesting thread that runs throughout all of nature, whether transcended being or human being, to want to take hold of and manipulate life just because you can, because you understand it more than somebody else does.
And that is a concept that I think is very prevalent in sci-fi, is the manipulation of everything.
Yeah.
Like, for one thing, to create hyper beings, if you want to call them that, or manipulating the flow of time. Everything is manipulatable, everything is moldable. So with that belief, then you can make things better or you can make them worse.
Well, and essentially that's a perspective on what neurophysics is. By believing that everything is connected. I'm not saying that the scientists just believe, because I believe Lamp is alive. It's alive. Like, no, it is more than that. But basically, it's more of a transcended intelligence to be able to see and understand that everything is alive. Because you can do that, then all of a sudden, spacefair is possible. What they call hyperspace in Halo being slipstream space. Attaining that, using that as a form of travel and life, is completely possible. And we'll talk about what elements of that exist later. But yeah, so really it's similar, like you said, to Prometheus in the aspect of, taking what would believe to be religion. Okay, God created all of this stuff and everything like that. Okay, but in the universe of Halo, those gods were just creatures. They just were more intelligent. They were transcended. And they were able to create and manipulate life because of their transcendence. So elements of very sci-fi heavy, biblical creation are present.
I was thinking about that a second ago, where people are usually used to us being very, goofy, and here's this concept that we like from a thing that we like. They're getting like deep lore sci-fi nerd
Oh yeah,
Megan and John today.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, and everything I'm doing is basically just filtering down a whole bunch of stuff
Yeah.
as simply as I can. I would recommend mini books. I would not normally recommend the Forerunner saga of books. That's where most of this history is coming from, is this series of books by Greg Barrett, but it's so hard. It's
deep sci-fi.
Yeah, dude, it's
It's
really
like trying to
hard. I mean,
read Dune.
even the names are tough. Like names of Forerunners is hard.
Mhm.
Like they're not people. They're not people names. Like I don't remember the full name, but one of them's like Born Stellar, but it's more statements. Oh gosh. So a very close to the Forerunner's creation that eventually comes back later in Halo lore is the Engineers, or the Hagrok, where they're basically like floaty salamander squids that are telepathic. And they're one of the few that understand Forerunner technology.
Oh, those guys. Okay.
And there's one that's like named, I want to say like lighter than most or something like that. Like all of their names are gaseous based.
That's funny.
Yeah, like and Forerunners are very similar in their names are statements. They're meaningful. They're not identifiers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's the beginnings of the Halo universe. And so the Forerunners, that's what they're known by. They don't have exactly a species name.
Greg.
But at this point, billions of years ago, humans on the level of Star Wars level of technology existed. Is another significant thing. But how is that possible, considering most Halo lore, once you get to Earth years and calendar, is pretty normal. Like World War II happened in Halo. Like everything pretty much happens in Halo because the significant stories start to take place around 25. So it's reasonable. Yeah, we're getting
5
close,
years
dude.
away, dude.
And it's pretty fairly realistic, other than the concept of space colonization, but a lot of what's going on for humans is very relatable.
You know what? I didn't get my hoverboard. I want my money back.
Well, there's none in Halo either.
You can jump really far, though.
To bridge the gap from billions of years ago, science-heavy humans to what we know now, we have a lot of ground to cover, mostly centered around the Forerunner. So again, it has little to do with Chief because it's billions of years ago. The main characters of our Halo history are the Forerunners.
Mm-hmm.
So thus the Forerunner reign began. And after millions of years of caring for the galaxy and advancing themselves in their power, they'd actually forgotten how they got this power to begin with. Much like the Domain, losing details of past knowledge with every new piece added, the Forerunners had moved so far from the point of origin that they believed they rightfully inherited the mantle, and that the precursors meant for them to have it before peacefully disappearing and leaving the galaxy in their hands. This sort of pious belief led them to look down on the humans especially, and much of their expansion and advancement was done to ensure the mantle would remain theirs. Meanwhile, the humans long held that there was something fishy about the Forerunners' history and the mantle. Nevertheless, the species of the universe, including humans and Forerunners, simply went about life as much as it was during that time. So the Forerunners literally believed they were justified in being the caretakers of, and that's all that the mantle of responsibility is. It's not a tangible thing. It's literally this right. We being so advanced are like you as the parent are responsible for the child because you're more advanced than the child. Basically, they look at the whole galaxy like that. The Forerunners have this built-in deity complex of we're the best, so we're in charge.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, I was thinking when you said the mantle of responsibility, is it like the matrix of leadership? But you answered that question.
No, it's not nearly as physical, although some believe it to be physical. It's literally just this charge of caretaking the galaxy. And that's not arguably what the precursors even did with manipulating the galaxy is not true to the mantle itself. But what you see a lot of stuff play out closer to the game lore is centered around this mantle of responsibility to take care of the galaxy. And it's about the perspective on what taking care of the galaxy looks like. That's what's super important to the Halo universe, is that perspective. What does caretaking look like? For the Forerunners, it looks like merely policing it and making sure that everyone knows you're in charge. And, you only build up your success. I mean, even really, they're not even helping other species. They're not advancing other species. They're only advancing themselves. So are they really being that responsible? That's like having a kid and neglecting them.
What kind of knickknacks would you put on top of the mantle of responsibility?
Yeah. It's interesting when it's first introduced, because it does sound very much, I mean, the Matrix of Leadership is a pretty good example of, it's this idea of that's what makes you, like, literally in Transformers, to have that is to be the prime, to be in charge.
And someone fumbles it at some point, don't they?
Yeah.
Which movie was that? Was that 1983?
Yes.
Okay.
But in this case, it's more so what you do with what you've been given. Yes, you're advanced, but what are you doing with it? Are you helping people? Are you serving the galaxy's greater good, or are you lording it over? Is it about your power?
It's like being the king of a country. If you're not, you can be the king. It's very easy to be the king. It's very easy to rule a monarchy. But what are you doing? Yeah,
well, and a lot of this just came from this belief that they had of, well, we're chosen. We have this responsibility. We have to take care. I mean, look at those poor meatbag humans. Like, what are they going to do without us, making sure that the galaxy's safe? Like, you might not intentionally hate the humans, although some Forerunners do, but it's this idea of, by simply looking down on the rest of them, again, you're going against the mantle you hold, because it's just like, this stupid kid, why can't you just do stuff? Why can't you just take care of yourself? Why are you bothering me? Go make your ramen. I'm watching my like, it's this troublesome, like, no, you might not beat him. You might not call him stupid, but basically by the way you distance and look down and don't take care of them, you are, basically.
And I think a parent is that's a very good example for that, because like for a lot of people, being a parent comes naturally. No, having kids comes naturally. Being a parent is something completely different.
Sure. Yeah, everybody can have kids, but should you? And that's part of the thing, is that's arguably, again, we don't know why the precursors decided. That's something lost to the domain, and the domain's a great example, again, much like neural physics, of understanding in Halo, technology is never just technology. The more advanced technology is, it's more than tech. The domain is, it's kind of like trying to understand the Trinity. The domain is a thing. It's a concept. Not a person. It's a concept. It's a plane of existence. It's an entity. That's what I'm saying. It's like trying to understand the Trinity, dude.
It's not delivery. It's DiGiorno.
Yeah. So it's a great example of, like, so it's not a USB. It's not a Kindle, but it's also not Alexa or Siri. But everything is held within it. So, but in the domain, all history exists. Everything that has ever been exists because of the domain. So everything from the beginning of time exists and is recorded in the domain. But for whatever reason, it might have been in there, but we've moved so far from when it happened that we don't know why the precursors thought the Forerunners deserved to be devolved. But based on how they rule once they have the mantle of responsibility, you can kind of start to pick up on maybe why they weren't the best to be left in charge, because they had this God complex.
Makes sense.
So the humans expanded as much as they were allowed, and eventually happened upon and settled on a capital world full of ancient precursor structures and ships. These sorts of living structures that were created by neural physics could not be broken down by conventional means like time and erosion. They existed beyond such things and were transcended. So obviously transcended things needed to destroy them, which neither the Forerunners or the humans were advanced enough to have. They were manipulated into being by the precursors and thus stronger than any other material that existed or conventionally created. So rocks were conventionally created. As we mentioned, humans, if you believe in evolution, were naturally created. Therefore, they could be burned and shot and obliterated. They could be destroyed and be deconstructed by other conventional creations, like bullets and other weapons, with transcended technology like what were known as star roads, which were basically these filaments that the precursors used for travel. So at one point, there was just these literal physical roads of travel throughout the galaxy. They were not able to just be smashed by meteors, or they would never age and degrade because they were transcended. They were above such things. So it's because of these things and their existence that the humans wondered who made them and why the Forerunners, who seemed responsible for everything, couldn't control or use them or destroy them. If they belonged to someone greater than the Forerunners, then who and where were they? It was this distrust that helped breed hatred between the two creations. It was in exploring these left-behind structures, too, that existed a powder-like substance that the humans studied. It was simple and biological, but yet not alive. But when tested on live specimen, it seemed sterile, except in rare cases amongst animals where it would improve their life and vitality. So the humans just introduced it widespread and made use of it for hundreds of years even. But eventually the use started to show signs of an almost rabid and decaying result. This would spread from one infected to another and slowly started to ravage human life, and it became known as the Flood.
I know that one.
Yeah, so anyone who's familiar with Halo lore would start... Now it starts to sound familiar.
Yeah.
Okay, the Flood. This is actually a common enemy in Halo. In fact, you could almost mistake Halo 1 and 3 for zombie games, because at one point in the story, basically these life-eating, zombifying creatures come into play, and no longer are you fighting aliens, but now you're fighting space zombies. And so it starts to shift a little different than the normal sci-fi story.
Yeah.
And so the Flood have existed for, as we see, millions of years in the past.
And this is something that you've told me in person before. Like, there was a time where, like many things, I just wanted to hear you talk about something. And so I asked, hey, what's a Halo?
Yeah.
Or something like that, because that's how we communicate in our relationship.
Right. Tell me a thing. Tell me the
a
song
thing.
of your people.
And I have visual aids, by the way. John has dug out his little...
Just to make sure you keep interest with my boring, long-winded conversation.
Oh, I am very interested. If I'm quiet during, the talky bits, that's because I'm listening.
Sure. Well, as long as one person's interested, that's all I need.
And because I don't want to interrupt you. You're talking about something that you're passionate about.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
In general, just find something, let people talk about things they love. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the one talking, but, eventually you'll find somebody that likes hearing you talk about it, which for us is both of us.
I like hearing
because I love hearing you talk about stuff too.
Hey, have you ever heard about Heartless? Do you want to know what a Heartless is?
Don't ask. So in their pursuit of answers about the Flood, they discovered a creature that had been locked away in precursor containment and thus had been stored for millions of years. This creature itself was a precursor, and it was known by the name Primordial, the last precursor. And it turns out that the Flood was the final instrument of revenge by the precursors because it was the precursors. At least it used to be. The dust was created by the precursors dissolving their own physical forms, and it was sort of a reverse of neural physics. What was left slowly became corrupted and consumed life itself. The humans resisted, but ultimately could only flee from the Flood, because as long as life existed, so did the Flood. In one great act against the Flood, the humans destroyed a civilization belonging to the Forerunners. That had been overtaken by the Flood, something that would be normally, hey, thanks, man, good looking out. But many people died. Essentially, it's aliens rules, man. You take off, nuke it from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Mm-hmm.
So the Forerunners were led by a being known as the Didact. the ultimate warrior and one who hated the humans the most. He deemed them unworthy and declared war. And after nearly 50 years of war with the humans, the Didact and Forerunner Council eventually judged them and punished them for their resistance and affront to the mantle, and they devolved them. They put them back to the beginning of creation to give them a second chance and a form of penance. The same fate that almost befell the Forerunners millions of years ago.
And also the Goombas in the Super Mario Brothers movie.
Really?
Yeah, that's the whole point, is they're being devolved. That's what makes the Goombas. Oh, that's cool looking. What is that?
That's the Didact.
Oh, hi, Didact.
Yes. So you have to find your own visual aids. Again, I'm just trying to keep her interested.
Very easily distracted.
So basically the flood shows up, and what we'll come to find out is it purposely drove the humans to war with the Forerunners. Yeah. Because basically the precursors, which the flood are a very devolved and unsentient, I guess is a word, version of the precursors, but they are essentially one and the same. And so the ultimate goal in all of this was to basically destroy. And by destroying, being able to recreate. Because if the flood took over all life and assimilated all life, which is more appropriately what it is, it doesn't eat life. Yeah. It doesn't eat people. It hosts them.
Makes you a
it assimilates monster. Them. And like the Borg, if everything is Borg, everything's happy. Everything is good because Borg is best. If everything is flood, then all of a sudden everything is united. There's no more war. There's no more conflict. There's no more trouble for the mantle of responsibility, because all of a sudden there's only the flood. And that's essentially the goal of the flood. While it's not sentient and smart, it just acts on that. It seeks to only create more flood and seeks to be the only thing that exists.
He dab. I'm playing with the toy now. I'm sorry.
It was once the humans were out of the way that the flood struck the Forerunners, and they learned the truth that began the war long ago. Once the humans met the Forerunners and war began, the flood backed off, but it had now returned stronger than ever. But it was too late to do any good, and it became flood versus Forerunner. This led to a disagreement on how to handle the enemy, especially after the flood was aided by the Primordial. He's still around, by the way.
Cool.
Back when the Forerunners decided a massive galaxy-spanning weapon was necessary to kill the flood, they tested it out over the world where the Primordial was contained. It was then that the Forerunners learned the truth of the weapon they'd created. See, it didn't destroy life. It was disrupting neural physics. The structures, weapons, and even the domain existed on such science, and if the weapon was used, would be susceptible to destruction. So the halos is what we're talking about now. Yeah. Here comes the namesake, Halo. The Halo array is basically the Halo universe's Death Star, except it's galaxy-wide. Mm-hmm. And essentially the science is now, and this is where lores start to split. Basically, you start to get into Bungie lore versus 343. So in real-world circumstances, Halo was originally made, the first 3 games, including a couple of spin-offs, by Bungie. That's the original creator company. That's the parent company and everything. Eventually, though, Microsoft wanted to keep making games, and Bungie was done with Halo, so they gave their child company, 343 Industries, the project. Mm-hmm. Since, I want to say 2014, Halo has been a product of 343. So Halo 4, 5, and the upcoming Halo Infinite. And also, all extra media, all the books, including the Forerunner Saga, were created post-sale. So once 343 took over. Mm-hmm. That's when some lore started to change. Originally, the story was actually much simpler in the foundings of Halo. The simple fact was the Forerunners existed. They were the original, all-powerful creation, and eventually the Flood just showed up. Somehow the Flood had always existed, and it overtook them. The only way for the Forerunners to destroy it was to create the Halos. They fired the Halos, and they couldn't destroy the Flood, but they could destroy all life. Mm-hmm. And by destroying all life, they destroyed all food. That's the difference, is depending on what lore source you go to, life is either food or, again, it's assimilation. With this bit of lore, and I'm one of those I am a purist in that what exists now is lore. So it's the canon. So I'm not one that stops. Oh, 343 made bad stuff, so I'm not like I believe in their lore as the lore. But you can believe in just Bungie canon. But in this new lore, it goes further. It's not just destroying all life except the flood. It's not destroying their food. It's even greater than that somehow. Like it destroys life in the molecular level of its sentience.
Mm-hmm.
By destroying sentience, they can also destroy what the precursors create. So again, by that science that they believe in, neurophysics, that everything is alive, that means the things that they've made, the star roads that we talked about, the technology, all of that is sentient.
Mm-hmm.
So if the halos destroy sentience, it destroys humans, forerunners, and neurophysics, essentially. So the rub basically is they could not agree. Wait, so if we fire this, then it will destroy life, which we can protect ourselves. We don't care, but it'll destroy all of this technology that we have from the precursors that we want to control. We want to eventually figure out how to use and keep. So it becomes a conflict of, do we destroy everything for the sake of saving everything, or do we look out for our best interests?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is where a big fork in the road came, especially between the didact and his people, but more especially the didact and his wife. They do have concepts such as marriage and children and all that stuff. The didact's children had actually been killed during the war with the humans, and so that's arguably why he was so harsh towards the humans.
Oh, Crydact.
Yeah, I had to simplify it for the sake of the story, but the didact has a very sad story, and it's easy to make him the bad guy, but in reality, he's almost justifiable. You can see why he was driven to the means that he took.
You can Crydact.
Even if they were a little extreme.
I'm just making
So does that make a little bit more sense?
Yes.
So the halos destroy sentience, unless you subscribe to old lore where it just destroys life.
And also,
two different things.
Something before that I didn't want to interrupt you to say, but the Bungie canon just sounds like something fun.
Oh yeah, that sounds like something at a circus.
I would love to ride on the Bungie canon, but not really.
So there's a split between the didact and his people, and especially his wife. The didact, the leader of the people, wanted to preserve all of this technology that had been left by the precursors and built shield worlds that could protect the forerunners and whoever they deem worthy, essentially, and could prove to contain the flood, since firing the super weapons would not destroy the flood, but rather the matter and technology that he wanted to save.
Mm-hmm.
His wife and many others believed that sacrifice was necessary to save what they could, and so the super weapon was the only way to go. In an attempt to prove his way best, though, and to prove that there was a way to fight the flood rather than destroy life, the didact used a device known as the composer that took biological sentience and turned it into artificial intelligence and planted it in a cybernetic armature, effectively turning an individual into an AI drone that would mean they were immune to the flood.
Okay.
He composed thousands of Forerunner warriors, with or without consent, not entirely sure. Definitely composed humans without consent, though, creating an effective anti-flood army known as the Prometheans. This was the final straw, and for his affront to the mantle, his wife and the foreigners had the didact imprisoned in one of his own shield worlds called Requiem.
Didact.
So shield worlds, I feel like I will explain later, but for the sake of understanding it and not just brushing by it, this was the concept of an artificial world. It was a world within a world that revolved around a Dyson sphere. A Dyson sphere basically being an artificially created miniature star. Mm-hmm. So you could imagine an ecolab or imagine a fish tank.
It's a terrarium.
Yeah, essentially a very highly advanced terrarium. So basically a shield world, the outer world, it could literally look like a world, or it could look like literally like a metallic ball, but it was just the exterior. There were levels deep within, and some huge, level upon level upon level, and some literally just there's the outer level and then the inner level. But the secret to all shield worlds were that deep inside there was no core, but rather a portal. The real science of a shield world was that once you reached that portal, you stepped into slipstream space. this other plane of transportation that existed, to where essentially you would step through and no longer be in the core of the planet, but be somewhere else entirely. Were you still did that mean you were still on the planet? Sort of, because technically you were in that portal. This is where Halo science gets really interesting. So for instance, on one world called Onyx, the slip space core is probably a few centimeters all together. And yet inside was this maybe twice the size of Earth space. There was a world inside of this little sphere. When you stepped through the portal, you were in the sphere, therefore still on Onyx, but yet you were on this whole other planet. It's interesting science. So imagine the TARDIS, basically.
Okay.
Bigger on the inside technology.
There you go. Okay.
And so the Didact essentially believed that, okay, because these worlds are within worlds and are separated by a portal, it's like a bunker within a bunker within a bunker. If we went there, we would be safe. And if we kept the flood there, they couldn't get out and get to anything outside of that world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a way of containment and protection.
Sounds like a great plan. How did it go wrong?
Well, because they basically just didn't trust that it was the way. Like, could that really completely contain them? Everything they've seen about the flood is there was no stopping it. And something I didn't mention or kind of brushed by is, again, they were being helped by the Primordial, a precursor who could control precursor technology, including star roads and certain things. He was literally using the star filaments that I talked about earlier, like literal roads in space, and was using them to fling planets around and destroy fleets of ships. This is kind of power that the Forerunners could not control or defend against. So basically the Forerunners are like, dude, can we, like, is that really going to work? I mean, we're fighting someone that controls things we can't imagine. I think the best way to go is to destroy it all. Mm-hmm. And that was the conflict. And so, again, out of a, no, I'm telling you, this could work, he basically took millions of people, foreigner and a human alike, and turned them into robots, turned them into cyborgs, essentially. So, like, they come into play in, like, later Halo games, like Halo 4 and on, but Promethean warriors are basically, they look like robots, but, like, and this is going to blow your mind if you didn't know this, by the way, when you're killing those in Halo games, you're killing who they were. They might not remember who they were, but the knights that exist only exist because they once were people.
That's sad.
Yeah. Like, and what's even worse is when they get like really rampant, as they call it, or basically when they freak out because you're killing them. Although, to be fair, they try to kill you too. They open their carapace and inside is a skull. Inside is a human skull.
Oh, those guys.
Yeah. It's
okay.
bad.
You're going to hear that a lot in these episodes is, oh, I know what that is.
Yeah, so like they make it out to be this whole,
no.
oh, rawr, I'm scaring you, I'm bad guy. But no, that's evidence that they were once alive.
That's really sad.
Again, they might not remember who they were, and I'm not saying that when you kill a knight, you kill Joe Bob, but I am saying technically whether they were, like, if Joe Bob doesn't remember Joe Bob was Joe Bob, but you still kill Joe Bob, does Joe Bob care? It's a moral conundrum.
It's a trolley problem.
But you as Master Chief in Halo 4 and 5 kill so many Prometheans. It's so horrible. So,
this is sad.
Yeah. So, and that's why they were basically like, dude, mantle of responsibility.
You are
That was not responsible. And so that's why they basically... Now, technically, again, something I brushed past. Technically, the librarian, his wife, tells the council he's dead. They believe he's dead. She's the one that locked him away in a tomb, basically, on Requiem. Because she just couldn't bring herself to kill him.
I mean, she could let him fraud act. I'm sorry, I'm running out of puns.
Keeping him imprisoned was difficult, though, and at some point he was freed and imparted an impression of his consciousness on a different Forerunner. This became the Isodidact, who would go on to lead the Forerunners until the end. Meanwhile, the now Didact was re-imprisoned, and it was then that the Isodidact found and killed the Primordial after learning that it had corrupted the Forerunner's greatest AI, Mendicant Bias. The Primordial simply told the AI the truth and let it choose, and it chose to believe that the Forerunners were unworthy and assisted the Primordial and the Flood. It was when the primordial was killed that his consciousness released and was taken in by the grave mind, a mass created as a hive mind controller of the flood that lacked any sentience and life, but now had life because of the primordial. With the intelligence of the primordial and the power of the flood, the grave mind was too dangerous to be left alive, and the Halo array was the only option. The Forerunners left, led by the Didact's wife, the librarian, began to finally act responsibly with the mantle, and prior to firing the array, collected samples of all sentient life to be protected from the effects of the Halo ray by being brought to Installation 00, or the Ark. The Ark was a safe haven, but also a place that the Halo arrays were made, and to be protected from their effects, the Ark was well outside of the firing range. Anyone on the Ark was safe from the flood.
Mm-hmm.
Before firing the array, Mendicant Bias was recovered and tried for its crimes, and the Isodidact had him stowed away on the Ark with the task of forever contemplating one concept: atonement. The Isodidact, early in his life, had befriended a human that accompanied him on many missions. His name was Chakas. He was injured during the war, and the Isodidact saved Chakas by composing him and placing him in a monitor charged with caretaking one of the halos, in fact, the first halo to begin the firing sequence. And before leaving Chakas, Isodidact gave him a new name, 343 Guilty Spark. And thus the Forerunners left, retreated to the Ark, and fired the Halo array. Everything not on the Ark was obliterated, and thus the flood had no sustenance and was killed. The Isodidact and the remaining few took the task of restoring the domain, or really rebooting it, since firing the array didn't actually destroy all of its existence, though it would take hundreds of thousands of years for the domain to rebuild itself. The remaining Forerunners retreated, vowing not to meddle any more, and effectively leaving the mantle of responsibility up for grabs. Eventually, Forerunner ships made their way to with the saved specimens to the worlds throughout the galaxy, and life began anew yet again.
Which explains the re-evolution of everything.
Yeah.
Jeez Louise, this is lore heavy.
I mean, well, and if anything, like, it's where we somehow, although I don't know how in the Halo universe humans would have come to this, but it's how you could believe in the flood and the Ark, the story of Noah, like the flood that overtook everything, the Ark that saved everybody. The reason we exist is because of the Ark. Like, certain things like that, twisting real lore, or if you believe it's real, into science fiction of a sort of, yes, an Ark, but not quite Noah, and so forth and so on.
It's like that movie, Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow. Do you remember that one?
Nope,
Jude Law?
never seen it.
There was an Ark.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well,
Angelina
I mean,
Jolie
essentially,
was
that's the idea of the flood in, everything. Why was it named that? I don't know. Not necessarily. The creators named it such that way. Like, obviously, in universe, they weren't like, oh, let's call it the flood, because then we can make something called the Ark and save ourselves. Like, obviously, they wouldn't be in on the joke.
Yeah.
But the creators had that sort of commentary in mind of, I don't know that they necessarily started with, what if the flood wasn't the flood? And what if the Ark wasn't the Ark? And what if God wasn't God? But eventually, those kind of concepts leaked in clearly, and God became the primordials, and the Ark became Installation 00, and the flood became not water, but just an all-consuming, life-eating substance.
Wow.
Yep.
Sorry, I can't figure out how to put into words how I'm feeling about. Do you remember that scene in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull at the very end where she asks for the knowledge?
Oh yeah, and then she's exploded.
And then her brain explodes and her eyes go all fiery. That's how I feel right now. I feel like I've been given all of Halo knowledge, and we're not even done yet.
No. This is just the foundation. This is where then Halo lore begins. Because again, if you attribute Halo lore to what's closest to the games, then lore for you would be more closely to, what is the Covenant? Where did they come from? Why do they hate the humans? And what is the deal? Because one side says the Halos transcend, one side says the Halos obliterate. What's true?
Yeah.
And so as you get closer to game lore, more familiar things like that start to play in. But in order to get there, you have to get the foundations of the entire galaxy. Essentially, this is what jump-started history as we know it. If you imagine yourself in the Halo universe, everything you know about history begins at creation like that. You know, whether you believe in, you know, God or believe in Darwinism, at one point or another, life was created and began, and we've been existing ever since.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to that was this whole universe of lore, all about basically fighting over responsibility for the galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
And then getting it and not being responsible with it. You want the power of responsibility, but not the choices that come with it, essentially.
Man, I don't want to. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, is
actually.
everybody wants to be responsible until they have to be. And then you realize, oh, nah, yeah, that's busy.
Everybody wants to rule the world.
And so there were foreigners that survived, but eventually just, again, died off. So Isodidact, his original name was Bornsteller. And essentially after the war, he left behind the title and consciousness of the Didact. He basically decided he didn't need it anymore and returned to himself. He was like, I'm done and I don't want to mess with life anymore, and went and lived happily ever after.
There was even a strong, independent Didact. And I don't need no Didact.
And along with his human friend Chakas, he had a friend named Riser. And they actually share a really interesting moment that comes into play much later, where they're just kind of looking over everything. You know, they know that life has been stored away. And the only reason Chakas and Riser were saved is because they were friends with the Didact, essentially. Like, they survived. Like, it's not really a loophole. It basically, the Didact was like, you can basically go into stasis, like, because essentially they stored everything, not literally like Noah did, but like by specimen. Like, they froze people, they froze things, and basically then re-released them and let them consummate, like Adam and Eve. Like, it started with a small amount and then grew from there, kind of style. Mm-hmm. Again, you start to see weird biblical themes, but
I do see weird biblical themes.
So it was like, hey, you could basically be stored and start over later, or you could come with me. And they went with him. Obviously, Chakas was turned into a caretaker for one of the halos, Installation 04. And it was the first halo to fire, which is why some theorize his name is Guilty Spark. It's the guilt of being the first one to light the fire, because before leaving his friend, which also, there's an interesting moral mirror, because the Didact, the original Didact, used the composer to unconsensually take life and make AIs, whereas the Isodidact asked for consent, like, do you want to continue to live? Because you can't live this way, but I can save you. But you won't be you anymore. You'll be an AI. And he chose to, like, it's two people with the same identity, per se, making two different decisions. But anyway, so before he left his friend Chakas, recently renamed Guilty Spark, he asked him, if you were in my shoes, would you fire? And Chakas couldn't answer. And so it's believed that that's why he named him Guilty Spark, in terms of he was imparting his own guilt on Chakas, in terms of he didn't want to do this, but they were led with no choice. So that's one meaningful moment. Fast forward, Halo Razor fired, everything's done, and then it's just Bornsteller, Isodidact, and Riser, and they're looking over what little they have saved. Literally little, like many Forerunners died, along with anything else that wasn't saved.
Maybe a couple Bothans.
Yeah, definitely Bothans. And they're just contemplating. They're just like, you know, what will you do now? You know, what's going to happen next? Mm-hmm. And they end hopeful. And Riser actually says, you know, I wonder what, like, our children, and obviously not talking about direct children. He's talking about like Abram children, like generation after generation, hundreds of thousands of years from now. I wonder if our children can meet and be friends. And Bornsteller just has one word for that, and he just says hope. Nice. It's a lot of really good, meaningful moments interspersed with so much sci-fi heavy stuff and everything. But essentially, that's what's left, is they saved the galaxy by storing it away and then obliterating everything else, and then giving it a chance to start over. So everything that happens after this, what starts to pick up in Halo lore, is what species and people do with their chance they've been given. how the Covenant is formed, what the military of humanity does in its expansion. Every decision is made after being given a chance they didn't know they had. They think this is the one and only chance, when in reality, this is their second chance.
Mhm.
And so it's just really interesting to have that in the back of your mind as all of this is going on, and knowing where all the foundations come from. You know what the characters don't. And so all of their decisions, you're just like, oh my gosh, if you just knew what you were talking about. If you think back to the first Halo game, when we realized, wait, this isn't going to destroy the Flood, this is going to destroy literally everything.
Mhm.
That basic realization, but thousands of times over, because literally every freaking character
Yeah.
eventually realizes, oh, it's not what I thought it was.
Well, there's a thought in, I don't remember what religion, but there is a religion that believes that this is not the first iteration of Earth.
Mm-hmm.
This is a recycling of Earth, basically, to where every time humans mess up and we die, we are then reincarnated into our new selves. Like, there's a belief that the world ended in 2000
Mm-hmm.
and we just started over.
Okay.
I know. I know.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, like, so, I mean, as a bit of a teaser for what's to come, because now we're done with this week's lore bit.
Aw.
And essentially, this is all, again, the huge pregame lore. This is what sets up everything else that comes into play for the Halo universe. That is not too far off from the Covenant. The Covenant being a band of alien species that believe essentially in transcendence because of the Forerunners. And again, it's just interesting to see what they do with what they've been given. And it's going to be interesting. It's a lot of interesting stuff. And there's even more to discuss before we ever get near the games, including where does John come from, Master Chief?
Okay.
How does the Flood even come back together? And why, again, the Covenant are anti-human? Like, what in the world? So much more. So we haven't even necessarily reached game lore yet, but hopefully it was slightly interesting. Hopefully you'll be back next week. Again, if anything, it's just good story. So I do recommend the books. Again, normally I don't recommend the Forerunner saga just because they're hard reads. Like, you have to be dedicated Star Wars, not Star Wars, sci-fi fan to be able to digest it.
Yeah.
But if you can get through it, it's so worth it, because all of this, so much of this takes place in those books.
Yeah.
And I have really, really simplified it. So if you are in any way more interested, definitely check that out. But we will chug along and continue in the timeline next week, and just continue to go. Again, this is kind of just a chronological look at the Halo universe, because you can just play the games, but to get the story, it's so much more. And so if I can get anybody to read a Halo book because of this, that's the win for me. So there you go.
Yeah, don't listen to Brian David Gilbert.
No, yes.
No, actually do, though, because he's funny, but at the same time,
not for a literal an example of stuff. He does an even simpler version of things than I do.
Yeah, this is a good enough summary of the Forerunner lore.
Right. So stay connected with us. Let us know what you thought. Let us know how much you hated all of this on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of that good stuff. And if you have anything about Halo you want to tell us about, we would love to hear it. I especially. And if any of you have actually read the books before, that would even be interesting to know, because I very rarely meet anyone that's read Halo books. So I'd say let us know if you want us to continue, but I kind of plan to continue anyway because I like doing this. Because Halo, again, is something I really, really love, but not for the games or the lore.
I'm enjoying myself so far. I like lore explorations in what I consume in general.
Well, and, it's a roundabout way to introduce Halo. Again, something you might have played the games and this might be new, or you may have never heard of Halo and this is new. Again, it's just a way to generalize something I love, and hopefully transmit it to you and give you something new to love and whatnot. So, but thank you to our patrons, Jim, Doug, and Rebecca. You guys pay for this for some reason, and we appreciate you so much. And everybody that listens to the ads and puts up with that, thank you, because that also pays for the show. Thank you to our friends and supporters in Red5Network and Game Infinite. We highly recommend you check out both of those on Twitter and Instagram. They are great communities of people, better than us even. So if you want better company, gooder company, all that good stuff, check them out for sure. And yeah, we'll be back with more Halo history next week on NerdyVerse.
I just got a notification from Wish. I want to put this on the show that said, "What happened to TikTok?"
What did happen to TikTok?
Wait a minute. You know, this is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.